The napkin was folded so tightly it looked like it was hiding a secret. I remember that before I remember anything else, before the roar of the engines, before the man 3 rows back with the unmoving eyes, before the panic that would ripple through the cabin like a silent scream. Just that napkin. It landed on my tray table as gently as a falling leaf, and yet my heart reacted as if someone had slammed a door inside my chest. I was halfway through typing a message to my mother, landing in 3 hours. Don't check your phone. I want to surprise you, when the flight attendant brushed past me. Her perfume was faint, something floral and clean, and her smile had been practiced the way airline smiles often are. Polite, distant, safe. But the napkin was not safe. I unfolded it slowly, thinking perhaps it was a misplaced receipt or a drink order. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, the ink pressed deep enough to nearly tear the paper. Pretend you are sick. Get off this plane right now. I stared at the words long enough for them to blur. My first instinct was confusion. My second was irritation. My third was fear. I wish I could say I was brave in that moment. I wasn't. I was just a tired travel nurse on her 4th flight in 2 weeks, craving the smell of my mother's cooking and the softness of her hug. I was wearing gray scrubs under a cardigan that had begun to pill at the sleeves. My shoes were comfortable but ugly. I felt invisible, the way people who live out of suitcases often do. Invisible people don't get warnings. I lifted my head, scanning the aisle. The flight attendant, her name tag read Alara, was assisting a couple with their overhead luggage. Her hands were steady, but her jaw looked tight, like she was holding something between her teeth that she couldn't spit out. The plane doors had just closed. The familiar ding echoed overhead. Seatbelt signs glowed to life. Around me, people adjusted pillows, scrolled through phones, sighed into armrests. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary people, except they didn't feel ordinary anymore. 3 rows ahead, on the left side, a man in a dark coat sat perfectly still, not rigid, just observant. His eyes moved without moving his head. I wouldn't have noticed him before the napkin. But now he felt like a punctuation mark in a sentence I didn't understand. Behind me, a teenage boy kept rubbing his palms against his jeans, over and over. His knee bounced like a nervous metronome. He looked young enough to still be afraid of thunderstorms, and suddenly the air inside the cabin felt different, thicker, as if everyone else was breathing normally and I was inhaling through a straw. I read the message again. Pretend you are sick. Get off this plane right now. It wasn't a prank. There was no smiley face, no flourish. Just urgency pressed into cheap paper. My thumb hovered over my phone screen. I thought of texting my mother again. I might be delayed. But I couldn't even explain why. How do you explain a napkin? My throat felt dry. The recycled air tasted faintly metallic, like coins on the tongue. Chen. I folded the napkin once more and slipped it into my pocket, my fingers trembling more than I wanted them to. For a moment, I tried to reason with myself. Cassia, you work in emergency wards. You see panic every day. You know what fear looks like. You know what irrationality looks like, too. But the handwriting hadn't been irrational. It had been desperate. The engines began their low growl as the plane pushed back from the gate. That vibration, the one that usually comforted me, now made my ribs buzz with unease. I closed my eyes and pictured my mother's kitchen instead. The chipped blue bowl she always used for fruit, the lemon dish soap, the tiny crack in the tile near the sink that she swore gave the floor character. I was flying home to surprise her for her birthday, 50, 8 years old. She'd been telling everyone she was 50, 5 for the last 3 birthdays, and I never corrected her. Some lies are gentle. The last time I saw her, she hugged me for so long my neck hurt, and when she let go, she said, "You're getting thinner," which was her way of saying she missed feeding me. I wanted that hug again. I wanted normal. I wanted predictability. Instead, I had a napkin telling me to run. The flight attendant passed my row again. This time her eyes met mine, only for a second. But in that second, her smile flickered just slightly, and I saw it. Not fear exactly. Not panic. Urgency. The kind you see in hospital corridors when a doctor walks faster than usual, but doesn't want the family to notice. I pressed the call button above my seat. The soft chime sounded louder than it should have. My heart thudded in response. The man 3 rows ahead didn't turn, but I saw his reflection shift in the dark window. Alara arrived almost immediately, too quickly, as if she had been waiting. "Yes, ma'am," she asked, voice calm, eyes sharp. My mouth opened, but the words stuck. I had to force them out. I'm not feeling well." It wasn't a lie. My pulse had climbed into my throat. Her gaze softened in a way that felt like relief. "Of course, let's take care of you." Her hand touched the edge of my seat, light, deliberate. A signal, not to anyone else, to me. And in that small, quiet gesture, I understood something without knowing why. I unbuckled my seatbelt. The teenage boy behind me stopped bouncing his knee. The man ahead remained motionless. The engines hummed louder as the plane angled toward the runway. Alara leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I said, though my legs felt like borrowed furniture. "Good," she replied, and for a split second her professional mask slipped. "Stay with me." I stepped into the aisle, feeling dozens of invisible eyes brush against my back. The cabin suddenly seemed narrower, the ceiling lower. As we moved toward the front, I realized my hands were clenched into fists. I forced them open, pretending to press against my stomach like someone fighting nausea. Acting sick suddenly felt less like acting and more like survival. Near the cockpit door, Alara bent slightly as if adjusting her shoe. Her whisper barely touched. "You did the right thing." The plane slowed. Somewhere behind us, a voice raised in confusion. A bag thudded against an overhead bin. The engine's pitch shifted, no longer accelerating but easing, like a breath held too long finally released. I didn't know what was happening. I must mend it. I only knew one thing with absolute clarity. If I had ignored that napkin, I would still be in seat 18A, pretending everything was normal, and something inside, me, something quiet but certain, knew that normal had already left the plane. The first thing I noticed when we stopped moving was the silence. Not the complete absence of sound. Airplanes are never silent. But the kind of hush that falls when a room full of people senses something is wrong but doesn't yet know what. Conversations thinned into whispers. The engines lowered to a tired murmur. Even the air conditioning seemed to breathe more quietly. Alara kept her hand lightly on my elbow as we stood near the front galley. From here, I could see the narrow corridor leading to the cockpit door, the metal handle polished by thousands of anxious fingers. I smelled brewed coffee and reheated bread, the familiar scent of airline meals, but now it felt strangely comforting, like a memory from a life that existed an hour ago. "Just breathe slowly," she murmured, loud enough for anyone nearby to assume she was tending to a sick passenger. But her eyes were scanning, counting, measuring. I recognized that look. I'd seen it in emergency rooms when doctors assessed a trauma victim before anyone else realized how serious it was. I nodded, placing my palm against my stomach as if I were fighting nausea. In truth, my stomach was perfectly fine. It was my thoughts that were churning. The plane began to taxi again, but not toward the runway. The turn was too sharp, the motion too deliberate. Even someone who rarely flew could feel the difference. A ripple of confusion passed through the cabin. A man 2 rows back leaned into the aisle. "Why are we turning around?" Alara didn't answer him. Instead, she pressed a discreet button near the galley. A soft chime echoed through the speakers, followed by the captain's voice, smooth, rehearsed, but just slightly tighter than normal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are returning to the gate due to a minor medical situation. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." A minor medical situation. I almost laughed. The irony tasted bitter. The teenage boy, Finn, I would later learn, craned his neck to look forward. His face had gone pale, freckles standing out like ink drops on paper. When our eyes accidentally met, he looked away so quickly it was as if he'd touched something hot. The man in the dark coat, the one with the stillness, finally moved. Just a shift of posture. But it was enough to make my shoulders tighten. He didn't look alarmed. He didn't look curious. He looked calculating. I turned back toward Alara. "What's happening?" I whispered. Her lips curved into a reassuring smile for anyone watching, but her words were for me alone. And he didn't. "You're helping more than you know." That wasn't an answer. It was a burden disguised as gratitude. The plane rolled slowly, the vibrations beneath my feet steady and low. I became hyper-aware of everything: the faint rattle of an overhead bin, the distant cough of a passenger, the scratchy texture of the carpet under my shoes. My senses felt sharpened, as if fear had polished them. I thought of my mother again, of her laugh that started in her chest and climbed into the air like warm steam, of the way she would pretend to scold me for not calling enough, then send me home with containers of leftovers I never asked for. I wondered, briefly, what she would be doing at this exact moment. Probably watering her plants. Probably humming that old song she always forgot the lyrics to. The idea that I might have never reached her, that this ordinary flight could have been the last ordinary thing I did, slid into my mind like a cold draft through a cracked window. The wheels bumped gently as we re-entered the gate lane. A few passengers clacked lightly, assuming the situation was nothing more than a routine inconvenience. People always clap when they think danger has passed, even if they never knew it existed. Alara guided me to a fold-down seat. "Sit for a moment," she said softly. "You're doing fine." I sat, my knees suddenly aware of their own weight. My reflection stared back at me from a chrome panel, brown eyes wide, hair slightly frizzed from travel, a woman who looked more tired than frightened. It struck me how ordinary I looked, how unremarkable. And yet, someone had written me a warning as if my life mattered urgently. The cabin doors hadn't opened yet. That, more than anything, unsettled me. We were at the gate. We had stopped. But no one stood up. No overhead bins opened. It was as if the plane itself was holding its breath. Then it happened. 2 men in plain clothes rose from different sections of the cabin at the same time. Their movements were synchronized without appearing rehearsed, smooth, purposeful. One flashed a badge so quickly most passengers probably didn't catch it. The other placed a firm hand on the shoulder of the man in the dark coat. The still man stiffened. Voices rose. Confusion thickened. Someone gasped. A suitcase fell from an overhead compartment with a dull thud that sounded louder than it should have. "Sir, remain seated," one of the plain-clothed men said, his tone calm but immovable. The man in the coat smiled, a small, thin smile that never reached his eyes. He didn't resist. That was what made it chilling. He simply lifted his hand slightly, as if surrender were an inconvenience rather than a threat. More movement followed. Another passenger, a woman near the wing, was quietly escorted into the aisle. Her face held the blankness of someone who had rehearsed neutrality. The teenage boy Finn shrank into his seat, his breathing visible even from where I sat. I looked at Alara. Her expression had changed again. The warmth was gone, replaced by something steelier, professional, focused. She was no longer playing the role of caretaker. She was conducting a silent orchestra of controlled chaos. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She didn't look at me when she answered. "Safety." The words settled over me like a blanket that was too heavy to be comforting. Then an announcement crackled overhead. This time not from the captain, but from a voice that carried authority without apology. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Federal air marshals are on board. This is a security matter. You are safe. You are safe." I repeated the phrase silently, tasting it. Safe. It felt both reassuring and hollow, like a promise made after the storm had already begun. Through the narrow gap between seats, I saw one of the marshals open the overhead bin above row 18, my row, my seat. My lungs felt tight. The world seemed to narrow, framed by the cold lights and metal around me. The marshal reached carefully into the overhead compartment, gloved hands moving slowly, while another stood watch over the aisle. Time seemed to stretch. When he pulled something out, it was a small, wrapped object, something that could easily be mistaken for a forgotten personal item. But the way he handled it showed it was more than that. A quiet murmur spread through the cabin. I pressed my hand to my mouth. Seat 18A, my seat. My seat. The one I would have been in if not for a folded note in a stranger's urgent handwriting. My legs shook, not just from fear but from the sudden realization of how close the situation had been. Ilera looked at me, her eyes confirming something too serious for words. I wasn't ill. I had never been ill. I had been protected, and I still didn't understand why. That moment changed something inside, me quietly but deeply, like a picture frame that tilts and changes how you see everything. I kept looking at the now, empty overhead bin, needing to believe the worry was truly gone. The dull plastic reflected the lights, ordinary, yet I could almost see the shadow of what had been. Around me, whispers started, a man on the phone, a woman clutching her bag, a young boy pressing his forehead against the seat. The air felt different, sharp and brittle, like the silence after something breaks. Ilara crouched beside me, whispering, "Stay calm, Cassia." I blinked. "How do you know my name?" She paused briefly, then said, "I saw your boarding pass." It seemed like a simple answer, too simple. From years in hospitals, I knew small truths often hide bigger lies. Two officers entered the cabin, their presence calming the crowd. Conversations quieted. People sat straighter. Authority has a way of filling a room, crisp and clear. The man in the dark coat was led toward the exit. His calm face scanned the cabin one last time, and when his eyes met mine, they lingered just a moment too long. I felt noticed, not as a person, but as a detail. Unease settled in again, not panic, but a quiet awareness, like standing in the wrong place too long. Another woman was led out, her face unreadable. No tears, no protest, just a strange calm, like stepping off a bus. Questions began to ripple through the passengers. What had happened? Who were they? Words floated like leaves, never quite settling. I sat still, hands clenched tightly, my knuckles pale. I focused on my breathing, slow, steady, like when I tried not to pass on worry to others. I looked at Ilara. Was it meant for me? The question slipped out before I could stop it. It felt selfish the moment I thought it. Why would anything be meant for me? I was just a travel nurse, moving from city to city, with more scrubs than dresses. My biggest secret was still sleeping with the same pillow I'd had since college, but the thought was already there. Her eyes softened, but not with pity. With calculation, we don't know yet. It was the kind of answer professionals give when they know more than they're allowed to say. The cabin doors finally opened. Fresh air drifted in from the jet bridge, carrying the faint scent of airport coffee and disinfectant. People stood too quickly, bumping into each other, retrieving bags with trembling hands. The ordinary impatience of travelers returned, but it was different now, tinged with adrenaline. Ilara placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Wait here." I watched passengers file out, their faces flushed with the thrill of surviving something they hadn't fully understood. Some looked annoyed, already complaining into their phones about delays. Others looked shaken, eyes darting like birds startled from a tree. Finn lingered near his seat, clutching his backpack straps. When he finally stepped into the aisle, he glanced toward me again. There was something in his expression, not fear exactly, guilt perhaps, or recognition. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it and moved on. That unfinished moment bothered me more than it should have. A tall woman in a navy blazer approached the front of the plane. Her posture was straight, her stride measured. She flashed credentials to the officers with practiced ease. When she looked at me, her gaze held the quiet assessment of someone used to reading people quickly. "Cassia Vance," she asked. Hearing my full name in that environment made my spine straighten instinctively. "Yes, I'm Audrey." She extended her hand. Her grip was firm, warm. "We'll need to ask you a few questions." Her tone was polite, but it wasn't a request. It was a bridge already built. I just had to walk across it. They led me off the plane through a side exit, away from the curious eyes of other passengers. The airport corridor smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and recycled air. My footsteps echoed louder than usual, as if the building itself were listening. We entered a small room with beige walls and a metal table. It reminded me of hospital consultation rooms, spaces designed to hold difficult conversations without absorbing any emotion from them. Audrey sat across from me, Ilara standing near the door. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was intentional. Audrey slid a printed sheet across the table. My name was highlighted. So was another name I didn't recognize. "Do you know this person?" she asked. I shook my head. "No." She studied my face, not unkindly. "He changed his flight last night. Last minute. Seat reassignment placed you under the overhead bin where the device was located." The words felt clinical, like medical terminology. Seat reassignment. Device located. Neutral language for a life-altering proximity. So it wasn't for me, I said quietly. Audrey's expression shifted, a small, almost imperceptible tightening around the eyes. Not intentionally. Not intentional. It meant I had been an accident, a placeholder, a mistaken variable in someone else's equation. Relief and unease braided together inside me. I wasn't targeted, but I had been close enough to matter. Ilara finally spoke, her voice gentler than before. "You trusted your instincts. That matters." I looked at her then. Really looked. The uniform suddenly seemed like a costume layered over something deeper. Her posture, her awareness, the way she had moved through chaos with quiet authority, it all rearranged itself in my mind. "You're not just a flight attendant," I said. She held my gaze for a second, then exhaled softly. No. The room felt smaller after that admission, as if truth occupied physical space. Audrey leaned back slightly. "We prevented something serious today. Because of timing. Because of awareness. Because people did their jobs. But I heard the unspoken layer beneath them, and because you listened." I nodded, though my thoughts were already drifting elsewhere. To my mother's kitchen, to the chipped blue bowl, to the hug I still hadn't received. The ordinary life waiting for me suddenly felt fragile, like glassware balanced on a vibrating shelf. As I stood to leave, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from an unknown number. No greeting, no signature. Just one line. "You should have stayed in your seat." The letters seemed to glow against the screen, cold and deliberate. My heartbeat stumbled, then surged. The room, the table, the beige walls, they all receded for a moment, replaced by the echo of that sentence. I looked up at Audrey, at Ilara, at the door. Something inside, may that quiet, certain voice, spoke again. This wasn't over, and I was no longer invisible. "You should have stayed in your seat." I read the message 3 times before it felt real. The words were simple, almost polite in their structure. No curse, no exclamation mark, no theatrics. That was what unsettled me most. Anger is loud. Threats are usually dramatic. But this was quiet, intentional. Like someone closing a door very carefully so you wouldn't hear the lock turn. My fingers went cold around the phone. Audrey noticed the change in my expression before I spoke. "What is it?" I turned the screen toward her. The light reflected faintly in her eyes as she read. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, but enough for me to understand that this was no longer an abstract incident filed under security matter. It had crossed into something personal. "When did this arrive?" she asked. "Just now." Ilara stepped closer, her presence suddenly protective rather than procedural. "Unknown number," I nodded. My throat felt tight, as if the air had thickened again. Audrey took a slow breath, the kind people take before deciding how much truth to reveal. "We'll trace it." It was meant to comfort me. Instead, it made the situation feel larger, more official, more real. "I thought you said it wasn't meant for me," I whispered. "It wasn't," she replied carefully. "But now, you're connected, connected." A word that sounded harmless in everyday life. Connected to family, connected to friends. But here, in this beige room with fluorescent lighting and a metal table, it felt like a thread tied around my wrist, leading somewhere dark. I sat back down without realizing I'd moved. The chair was cold through my cardigan. My mind drifted to my mother again, the way it always did when I needed grounding. I pictured her watering her plants, humming off, Key, unaware that her daughter was sitting in an airport security room reading a message from someone who knew too much. I just wanted to surprise her, I said quietly, more to myself than to them. It was supposed to be simple. Alara's expression softened. Simple is rare these days. The room fell into a reflective silence. Outside the door, footsteps echoed, brisk, purposeful. Life continued in the airport corridors. Announcements, rolling suitcases, the distant hiss of espresso machines, ordinary sounds. They felt like they belonged to another world. Audrey's phone vibrated. She glanced at it, then at me. We've confirmed the device was professionally constructed, not improvised. This wasn't random. The words landed like stones in water, sending ripples through my thoughts. Professionally constructed. Someone had planned this with precision. Someone had expected a specific person to sit beneath that bin. And the whistleblower, I asked, the one who changed flights. Safe, she said. For now. For now. 2 words that carry no comfort at all. I looked down at my hands. The faint indentation of my wedding ring used to be there years ago, before my marriage dissolved quietly like sugar in tea. I hadn't thought about that in a long time. Funny how danger makes you inventory your life. The people you love, the choices you made, the roads you didn't take. I don't want protection, I said suddenly. The sentence surprised even me. I don't want escorts or guards. I'm not that person. Alara knelt slightly so our eyes met. Her voice was calm but firm. You didn't choose this, Cassia, but it chose you for a moment. Protection isn't about who you are. It's about what you know and what others think you might know. That distinction settled heavily. I wasn't important, but I had become relevant. Audrey slid a small card across the table. A number. A name I wouldn't remember later. You'll have temporary security. Discreet. You can still visit your mother. You can still live your life. We just adjust the perimeter. Adjust the perimeter. The language of safety always sounds like architecture. Walls, borders, layers. I nodded slowly, though my chest felt tight. I had spent years learning how to walk into hospital rooms without fear, how to hold the hands of strangers in their worst moments. Yet here I was, shaken by a sentence on a screen. Can I still fly today? I asked. Audrey exchanged a glance with Alara. A silent conversation passed between them, professional, measured. Yes, Audrey said finally, but not alone. The idea of being accompanied felt strange. I'd built my adult life on independence, rotating cities, signing short-term leases, learning airport layouts like second languages. The thought of someone watching over my shoulder felt both comforting and intrusive, like a blanket pulled too tight. As we stepped out of the room, the airport seemed louder than before. Announcements echoed overhead, blending into a mechanical choir. The smell of cinnamon pastries drifted from a nearby cafe. People hurried past with the urgency of ordinary schedules. No one looked at me twice, invisible again, and yet I knew I wasn't. Alara walked beside me for a few steps before stopping. This is where I leave you, she said. Her uniform looked different now that I knew the truth. Less like service, more like strategy. You're not just a flight attendant, I repeated softly. She smiled, a genuine one this time. And you're not just a passenger. There was warmth in her tone, but also a quiet warning. We were both stepping back into roles, into disguises that kept the world orderly. Thank you, I said. The words felt insufficient, like handing someone a coin for saving your life. But they were all I had. She tilted her head slightly. Trust that instinct of yours. It's sharper than you think. I watched her walk away, blending seamlessly into the flow of travelers. Within seconds, she was indistinguishable from every other uniform in the terminal. It struck me how many invisible guardians might exist around us at any moment, people carrying secrets the way others carry handbags. My phone buzzed again. For a second, my heart lurched, expecting another threat, but it was my mother. Did you land yet? I made your favorite soup today. Don't tell me if you're not coming. I'll still pretend you are. I smiled despite everything. The smell of lentils and cumin seemed to rise from memory itself. Her messages always carried warmth, like folded towels fresh from the dryer. Almost there, I typed. Save me a bowl. I didn't mention the plane. The device. The message. Some truths are too heavy to place in a parent's hands. As I slipped the phone back into my pocket, I felt a presence beside me. One of the discreet agents Audrey had mentioned. He nodded politely, maintaining a respectful distance. Protection had already begun, quiet as a shadow. We walked toward my new gate together. The polished floors reflected the overhead lights in long, bright streaks. Each step echoed slightly, reminding me that I was moving forward whether I felt ready or not. The world hadn't ended. The sky outside the windows was still blue. Planes still took off and landed with mechanical grace. And yet something fundamental had shifted inside me. A curtain pulled back just enough to reveal the machinery behind ordinary life. I wasn't Wave anymore. I wasn't just a traveler with a surprise planned. I was someone who had seen the thin line between routine and catastrophe, and felt it brush against my skin. And as I sat at the new gate, watching strangers scroll through their phones and sip overpriced coffee, one realization settled quietly into my chest. Safety isn't the absence of danger. It's the presence of awareness. The second flight felt quieter, even though it was fuller. Or maybe the noise was the same and it was my mind that had changed, tuned to a different frequency, listening for things I had never noticed before. The click of seatbelts fastening sounded sharper. The rustle of magazines felt louder. Even the soft hum of the engines carried a low, constant reminder that I was suspended between destinations, between safety and uncertainty. The agent assigned to accompany me, Daniel, he'd introduced himself simply, sat one row behind. He didn't watch me directly. Professionals rarely do. Instead, he watched reflections in the window, movements in peripheral vision, the way people's shoulders tensed or relaxed. I recognized the technique. In hospitals, I used to read families the same way before delivering difficult news. I leaned my head against the cool plastic of the window and watched the runway lights blur as we accelerated. Takeoff had always comforted me, that brief surrender to gravity before the lift. This time, it felt like stepping onto a bridge I couldn't see the end of. The napkin was still in my pocket. I could feel its folded edges against my thigh like a quiet heartbeat. I hadn't thrown it away. I wasn't ready to. Half an hour into the flight, the teenage boy Finn appeared beside my seat. He hesitated, gripping the top of the empty chair next to me. His hair was tousled, his freckles even more pronounced under the cabin lights. "Ma'am," he whispered. I looked up, surprised. "Yes, can I sit for a second?" I nodded. He lowered himself into the seat, shoulders hunched as if trying to occupy less space. For a moment, he said nothing. His hands twisted together, fingers restless. "I saw the message," he finally murmured. My pulse quickened. "What message?" The napkin," he clarified quickly. "Not the text. I didn't see that. He swallowed. "I saw her give it to you." "Her, Elara, and—" I asked gently. He stared at the floor. "I thought maybe you were part of it. At first. Then when you stood up, I realized you weren't." His voice cracked slightly. "I wanted to say something earlier, but I got scared." His honesty was disarming. Fear always is when it's admitted plainly. "Were you part of it?" I asked. My tone calm but direct. His head snapped up, eyes wide. "No, I swear. I noticed things. The guy in the coat. He kept checking his watch. And the woman near the wing, she dropped her bag twice but didn't look nervous. People who drop things usually look embarrassed. She didn't. I studied him. The details he mentioned were accurate, observant. Not the ramblings of a frightened teenager, but the recollections of someone who had been paying attention. "You have good instincts," I said quietly. He shrugged, embarrassed. "My mom says I overthink. Sometimes overthinking is just careful thinking," I replied. "Peg." He gave a small, relieved smile, then glanced around the cabin. "I just wanted to say, I'm glad you got up." The sincerity in his voice settled warmly in my chest. "So am I," he returned to his seat, shoulders a little less tense. Watching him go, I felt a strange sense of shared survival. Two strangers connected by a moment neither of us had chosen but both had endured. The rest of the flight passed without incident. No messages, no suspicious glances, just the steady rhythm of air travel, beverage carts rolling, muted conversations. Yet beneath it all, my awareness remained heightened, like a muscle that had been stretched and hadn't yet relaxed. When we landed, the sky outside was painted in late afternoon gold. My hometown airport was small, familiar. The smell of roasted peanuts near the entrance hit me like a memory from childhood. For a moment, everything felt normal again. Daniel walked a few steps behind me as we exited. Not intrusive, just present. The sliding glass doors opened, and there she was. My mother. She stood near the railing in her beige coat, her hair pinned back the same way she'd worn it for decades. When she saw me, her face lit up, not dramatically, just a soft bloom of happiness that began in her eyes and spread outward. "Cassia," she called, her voice warm and slightly breathless. I crossed the distance quickly, dropping my bag just in time to catch her hug. She smelled like lavender soap and the faint spice of cumin, the scent of home itself. Her arms wrapped around me with familiar strength, and for a second, the entire day dissolved. "You're thinner," she said, pulling back to examine my face. "You always say that," I laughed softly. "Because it's always true," she insisted, patting my cheek. I didn't tell her about the plane, about the device, about the message that still echoed in my mind. I let her talk about her garden, about the neighbor's new dog, about the soup waiting on the stove. Ordinary details, precious details. Daniel gave a subtle nod from a distance before blending into the crowd. Protection, quiet as promised. That evening, I sat at my mother's small kitchen table, the chipped blue fruit bowl exactly where I remembered. Steam rose from the lentil soup, carrying the scent of garlic and coriander. The ticking clock on the wall filled the comfortable silence between our conversations. "You seem thoughtful," she observed gently. "Just tired," I said. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You work too hard," I smiled. If only she knew how close I had come to not sitting at this table at all. Later that night, lying in my childhood bedroom with its faded floral curtains, I took the napkin from my pocket. The ink had smudged slightly from the day's heat. "Pretend you are sick. Get off this plane right now." I traced the letters with my finger. Those words had altered my trajectory more than any grand decision ever had. They had reminded me that life doesn't always shift through big moments. Sometimes it pivots on small choices, quiet warnings, instincts we almost ignore. My phone buzzed once more. Another unknown number. My breath caught as I opened it. We notice the ones who notice. No threat this time. That somehow felt heavier. I locked the screen and set the phone face down. The room was dim, lit only by the street lamp outside, casting pale stripes across the floor. My mother's soft snoring drifted faintly from the hallway. I realized then that the world had not become more dangerous overnight. I had simply become more awake within it. And with that awareness came a strange mixture of fear and empowerment, like learning the ocean has depths you cannot see, yet choosing to swim anyway. I folded the napkin once more and placed it inside my journal, between pages filled with ordinary travel notes and grocery, not to danger, but to instinct. The next morning began like every morning I had ever spent in my mother's house. The kettle whistled before the sun fully rose. The smell of toast drifted down the hallway, slightly burnt because she always forgot it for a second too long. The radio in the kitchen murmured old songs through static, the same station she had listened to since I was a child. Ordinary sounds, gentle rhythms, and yet I woke with the strange awareness that someone, somewhere, knew my name. I lay still for a moment, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling paint above my childhood bed. It looked exactly the same as it had years ago, a thin white line shaped like a crooked river. I used to trace it with my eyes when I couldn't sleep after exams. Back then, my biggest fear had been disappointing a teacher. Now my fear was quieter, more abstract. It didn't shout, it lingered. I dressed slowly, choosing one of my old sweaters from the closet. It still smelled faintly of the detergent my mother used, citrus and something floral. Familiarity wrapped around me like a second skin, but it didn't erase the undercurrent of vigilance humming beneath my calm. In the kitchen, my mother was humming again, stirring tea with the same chipped spoon she refused to throw away. She turned when she heard my footsteps, smiling with uncomplicated warmth. "Good morning, traveler," she said. "You slept like a rock." "I needed it," I replied, kissing her cheek. Her skin felt warm, soft, alive, a grounding reassurance that the world still contained simple, beautiful truths. We sat at the small table, sunlight slanting through the curtains. She talked about the neighbor's cat, about the new bakery that had opened near the post office. I listened, nodding. Halfway through breakfast, there was a knock at the door. It was gentle, polite, the kind of knock that belongs to delivery drivers or neighbors returning borrowed dishes. My mother stood automatically, wiping her hands on a towel. "I'll get it," I said quickly, surprising both of us with the sharpness in my voice. She raised an eyebrow but sat back down. I walked to the door, my heartbeat steady but alert. Through the frosted glass, I saw the outline of a man, average height, straight posture, not threatening, not familiar. I opened the door halfway. "Miss Vance?" he asked quietly. "Yes." He showed a badge, discreet but unmistakable. Another agent, another layer of protection adjusting around my life. "Just a routine check," he said. "We'll be nearby today." Nearby. The word hovered like a shadow. I thanked him softly and closed the door, leaning my forehead against the cool wood for a second. My mother called from the kitchen. "Who was it?" "Wrong address," I answered. The lie tasted mild, almost harmless, but it settled heavily in my chest. I had never hidden things from her before. Not like this. The day passed in small domestic rituals: grocery shopping, watering plants, folding laundry. I noticed everything more acutely than before. The way strangers glanced at their phones, the way cars slowed at intersections, the reflection of my own face in store windows, searching for signs of tension I hoped weren't visible. In the afternoon, my mother insisted we visit the local market. She loved markets, the noise, the bargaining, the colors of fresh fruit stacked like paintings. I walked beside her, carrying reusable bags, breathing in the scent of oranges and roasted nuts. "Do you ever get tired of traveling?" she asked suddenly. "All the time." "Then why keep doing it?" I paused. The truthful answer rose before I could filter it. "Because I like knowing I can handle unfamiliar places," she smiled. "You always were brave in quiet ways." Her words lingered. Brave in quiet ways. I had never thought of myself as brave. Careful, maybe. Observant. But bravery had always seemed louder, more dramatic. Yet perhaps bravery sometimes looked like standing up when instinct whispered instead of shouted. That evening, while my mother napped on the couch, I stepped onto the small back porch. The air smelled of damp soil and jasmine from the neighbor's garden. My phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an unknown number. It was Audrey, checking in. "You safe?" I typed back. "Yes, thank you." A few seconds later, we're closing the loop. "Arrests finalized. You won't hear from them again." Relief washed over me, but it was gentle, cautious. Like stepping onto ice that looked solid but still testing its strength. "I appreciate everything," I wrote. Her final message came a minute later. "You did more than you know." I slipped the phone into my pocket and watched the sky shift from blue to violet. Birds crossed overhead in loose formations. Guided by instinct, they didn't question their direction. They simply followed the pull within them. That night, as I tucked my mother into bed, a reversal of roles that made her laugh softly, I realized something had changed in me that no protection detail or official reassurance could undo. I trusted myself more. Not because I hadn't. I had been scared, uncertain, reactive. But I had listened to the quiet voice inside me that said this isn't right, and that voice had been correct. The world didn't feel smaller after the incident. It felt clearer. Layers peeled back. I understood now that safety isn't guaranteed by systems alone. It is also guarded by awareness, by the willingness to pause when something feels wrong, by the courage to look twice. As I lay in bed, the house settling into nighttime creaks and whispers, I opened my journal and looked at the folded napkin once more. The ink was fading slightly, but the message remained legible. Pretend you were sick. Get off this plane right now. Those words had been a stranger's lifeline to me. A bridge built in seconds. A reminder that sometimes the most profound connections between humans happen without introductions, without names, just urgency. I slid the napkin back between the pages and closed the journal gently. The experience hadn't made me paranoid. It had made me present. And in that presence, I found something I hadn't expected. Not fear, not pride, but a quiet gratitude for the ordinary mornings, the chip spoons, the burnt toast, the voices that call your name with love instead of warning. Life had not become extraordinary. I had simply learned to notice how extraordinary the ordinary already was. In the weeks that followed, life did what it always does. It resumed. But it resumed differently for me. I returned to my rotation schedule, packing my suitcase with the practiced efficiency of someone who had turned departure into routine. Scrubs folded in neat stacks, toiletries in their clear pouch. The journal with the folded napkins slipped carefully between sweaters. My mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed in that affectionate way she had whenever she didn't want to admit she'd miss me. "Call me when you land," she said, as she always did. "I will." She hugged me longer than usual. Or maybe I simply noticed it more. The warmth of her cheek against mine, the faint scent of lavender in her hair, details that once blurred into familiarity now felt like small treasures. At the airport, everything looked exactly the same as it always had. Polished floors, rolling suitcases, glowing departure boards. Yet I moved through it with a heightened awareness, as if someone had adjusted the contrast on the world. Protection was still there, though less visible now. Occasional check, a nod from a stranger who wasn't really a stranger. Audrey's messages became less frequent, eventually fading into silence, a good silence, the kind that signals closure rather than abandonment. For a while, I believed the incident would simply become a story I told sparingly, a strange chapter that would gather dust in memory. Then the letter arrived. It was waiting in my mailbox at my temporary apartment, a plain envelope with no return address. Not threatening, not urgent. Just deliberate. My name was written neatly, the letters rounded and careful. Inside was a single sheet of paper. You reminded us that the smallest choices matter. Thank you for trusting your instincts. No signature. No emblem. Nothing that identified the sender. It wasn't from the perpetrators. I could feel the tone was too gentle. It felt like acknowledgement, not intimidation. I sat at my small kitchen table, the letter resting beside my coffee mug. Steam curled upward, carrying the bitter scent of roasted beans. Outside, traffic murmured in the distance. Life continued, indifferent and steady. I realized then that the experience had rippled outward, touching more lives than I would ever know. The whistleblower who had changed flights, the agents who had worked quietly behind the scenes, the passengers who had disembarked, unaware of how close they had come to disaster. And me, a travel nurse who had simply stood up when a stranger handed her a napkin. It wasn't heroism, it was participation, a quiet thread woven into a larger fabric. A hospital, my shifts resumed their familiar rhythm, the soft beeping of monitors, the squeak of rubber soles on polished floors, the low hum of late-night conversations at the nurses' station. Yet I found myself noticing subtle things I had once overlooked. The hesitation in a patient's voice before asking a question, the way a family member's hand trembled when signing consent forms, the unspoken fears that lingered in the spaces between words. Awareness had followed me into every room. One evening, while checking vitals for an elderly patient, she grasped my wrist suddenly. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You listen," she said. I smiled gently. "It's my job." "No," she insisted, her eyes sharp despite her frail frame. "You really listen." Her words echoed later as I walked home under the amber glow of streetlights. Listening, truly listening, had saved me on that plane. Not to others, to myself. I began calling my mother more often, not out of fear, but appreciation. We spoke about mundane things, grocery lists, television. Yet beneath every conversation lay a quiet gratitude that we still had time to discuss such ordinary topics. Months passed. The protection details faded entirely, The unknown numbers stopped. The world resumed its usual indifference, but I didn't return to who I had been before. I became more deliberate. When something felt wrong, I paused instead of brushing it aside. When something felt right, I leaned into it without overanalyzing. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It was subtle, like adjusting the angle of a mirror until the reflection finally aligned. One afternoon, I received a message from an unfamiliar email address. "She talks about you sometimes," it read. "Says you trusted her without question. That meant more than you know. No name, no context. But I knew, Elara. I pictured her moving through crowded terminals, blending into uniforms and anonymity, carrying secrets the way others carry luggage. Our connection had lasted only minutes, yet it had altered the course of my life. It reminded me that significance isn't measured by duration. "Sometimes a moment is enough," I replied simply. "Tell her thank you." There was no response. There didn't need to be. The public consequences of that day were never fully visible to me. News articles mentioned arrests, investigations, policy changes. Names appeared briefly, then disappeared beneath newer headlines. The world moved on, as it always does. But in quieter ways, the consequences lived on. Changes happened in the way I crossed streets with more awareness, in the way I read people's expressions more carefully, in the way I valued small certainties over grand assumptions. I didn't become fearful. I became attentive. And attention, I learned, is a form of love, love for life, for safety, for the fragile web of human connection that holds us together without our noticing. One night, while unpacking after another assignment, the folded napkin slipped from my journal and fluttered onto the floor. I picked it up, smoothing its creases. The ink had faded further, but the message remained clear. "Pretend you are sick. Get off this plane right now." Those words no longer carried fear. They carried gratitude. They were proof that intuition is not superstition. It is experience speaking quietly. It is the mind gathering details faster than conscious thought and whispering. Pay attention. I placed the napkin back into the journal, not as a relic of danger, but as a reminder of awareness. Life hadn't given me a second chance that day. It had given me a clearer first one. Sometimes when I'm sitting alone in an airport terminal now, watching strangers hurry past with their coffees and carry-ons, I think about how close we all walk beside each other's stories without ever knowing it. The woman beside you might be carrying grief in her handbag. The man across from you might be on his way to forgive someone, and the quiet person by the window might be holding a folded napkin that once changed the direction of their life. What stayed with me wasn't the fear. Fear fades. What stayed was the realization that instinct is not loud. It doesn't shout or demand. It whispers. It nudges. It taps gently on your shoulder and waits to see if you will turn around. That day on the plane, I wasn't brave in the cinematic way people imagine bravery. I didn't fight anyone. I didn't solve a mystery. I simply listened to a feeling that didn't make sense yet, felt undeniable. And that small act, standing up when something inside me said this isn't right, became the quiet hinge on which everything turned. Since then, I've learned to respect those small inner signals, the hesitation before signing a paper, the pause before trust, the sudden warmth that tells you someone is safe. They are not always perfect, but they are rarely meaningless. Life did not become dramatic afterward. I still pack my suitcase the same way. I still burn toast when I'm distracted. I still call my mother and let her talk about her garden for longer than I intended. The extraordinary did not replace the ordinary, it simply taught me to cherish it. Because in the end, safety is not just the absence of danger, it is the presence of awareness. And awareness is something we carry within us every day, often unused, like a key we forget is in our pocket. So I'll leave you with this gentle question, the kind that lingers rather than demands an answer. Have you ever ignored a quiet instinct and later wished you had listened? If this story touched something in you, a memory, a lesson, or even a small realization, hold on to it, share it, talk about it. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, the kind that remind us of our shared humanity and the quiet strength we carry, stay with me here, because sometimes the smallest choices are the ones that keep us here to tell the story.